Well, hi there. Welcome to episode 347 of Roqe. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. And before we begin today's show, a related question, a question about history's gaps, about what is chosen to be remembered and what is conveniently forgotten. Why has the devastation of Iran during World War II been largely ignored? Now, take it slow. How much do you know? Think about it. Many of us are familiar with the sweeping dramas of that epic global war, stories of courage and loss and liberation, the Nazis invading Poland, the Blitz in London, Hiroshima, Pearl Harbor. These are the tales etched into our collective memory, the landmarks of the 20th century. But Iran? Even for those of us who majored in history and political science, little was taught about Iran's experience during World War II. Little about the famine that ravaged the country, little about the occupation, little about the fact that Iran, neutral in the war, was invaded by Allied forces. Its sovereignty erased, its resources drained, its people left to starve, and treated with disdain. Why has the devastation of Iran during World War II been largely ignored? It's a question that feels poignant as the world continues to grapple with Iran today. The often neglected images of protests, bravery, and resilience. The disregarded calls for justice and freedom. It is history that reminds us that this is not the first time pain has been sidelined and suffering has been dismissed. And of course, if there is no understanding of the past, how can the future be cast? Why has the devastation of Iran during World War II been largely ignored? Here's the quick version of the story. In 1941, Iran declared neutrality, hoping to avoid the war's devastation. But geography made neutrality effectively impossible. The British and Soviets invaded, aiming to secure a supply corridor and access to Iran's oil. Reza Shah, who had worked to modernize Iran and assert its independence, was forced to abdicate. His son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, took the throne under circumstances where outside powers made it clear they were in control. This wasn't a strategic maneuver. It was a calculated removal of power, a chapter where Western imperial greed once again came to flower. The occupiers drained Iran of its resources, leaving the population to starve. Food was diverted to serve Allied troops. Famine swept the country. Diseases like typhus spread unchecked. Millions of Iranians died, not in battle, but in their homes, from hunger, disease, and neglect. Why has the devastation of Iran during World War II been largely ignored? Maybe because, as we've come to realize, history is written by the victors. And in this case, from a largely Western perspective, where the Allies are the heroes and their actions are rarely questioned. Acknowledging the suffering they caused in Iran complicates that narrative. And let's be clear, this is not to condone the atrocities of the Axis powers. The horrors perpetrated by Nazi Germany are undeniable. But Iran's plight doesn't fit into a narrative dichotomy of good versus evil during the war. And so it has been something largely in the West to ignore. Add to this that Iran's destruction wasn't as cinematic as other parts of the conflict. No bombed out cities, no iconic battles, no burning buildings, no desperate screams, just shattered lives and stolen dreams. Just the quiet violence of exploitation. But then, hang on. The blame also doesn't rest solely on the West. Within the Iranian community, this chapter of history has often been overlooked as well. It has faded into the background, overshadowed by the more dramatic struggles of recent decades, the revolution, the hostage crisis, the protests of today. Sometimes it's easier to not talk about more atrocities of the past. But this story matters, not just because it is a tale of suffering, but because it is a testament to resilience. The devastation of Iran in World War II wasn't just a tragedy, it was a moment that tested the endurance of a nation that refused to break, a people forced to bend but never forsake. And to ignore this history is to deny its lessons. To erase the suffering is to repeat the indifference. And maybe that's the point. Iran's story during World War II, like so much of its history, is a reminder that silence is complicity, that overlooking a nation's pain doesn't make it disappear, it only amplifies its echoes in the generations to come. Why has the devastation of Iran during World War II been largely ignored? Because forgetting is easy, because it's convenient, and because expecting fairness in historical narratives is absurd. But the truth has a way of finding its voice, and history has a way of demanding to be heard. All right, coming up, a conversation with author Sepehr Haddad and his brand new book focused on a family trying to make ends meet in Allied-occupied Iran during World War II. Let me introduce our feature interview for today's show and the conversation that is related to the title of this program, Iran during World War II, The Overlooked Devastation. So last week we held a book launch here in the Roqe Hub with an author who has been exploring the subject of Iran during World War II and has written a really engaging new book of fiction that helps explore so much of what happened in Iran during that period. The author's name is Sepehr Haddad. Sepher was born in Washington, D.C. Then in 1965, at the age of 8, his family returned to Iran, where he completed his elementary and secondary school. He came back to the U.S. for college, where he ended up at the University of California at Davis and graduated with a master's degree in international agricultural development. He moved from California to Washington, D.C. and began working for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. He is one half of the celebrated musical duo Shaheen and Sepehr, but he is also now a celebrated author. In 2021, Sepehr released his first novel, 100 Sweet Promises, based on a true family story about a forbidden love between his grandfather and a Russian princess. The protagonist of the story is composer Nasr Sultan Minbashian, Sepehr's grandfather, who would also play a role as one of the pioneering creators of the Iranian contemporary music scene. That book went on to be a #1 Amazon bestseller in the category of Middle Eastern literature. His brand new book is a World War II family saga that takes place in Allied-occupied Iran called The Harmless Necessary Cat. Now, Sepehr flew up from Washington, D.C. to be with us last week, and we had a really compelling conversation in front of a good crowd here at the Roqe Hub. Here is an on-stage interview with Sepehr Haddad about his latest book.
Thank you.
So, first of all, thank you for that reading, and thank you for being here. I think this book is brand new, right? I mean,
Yes,
this is
just a week, 10 days old.
It's just been published.
You're the first person I'm talking with about it.
Wow, we are the first person. We are collectively the first person.
Yes,
you're
all of
talking-
us, so I appreciate you all coming, really.
The most profound effect that this book had on me immediately was to come to terms with my own ignorance about World War II vis-a-vis Iran. I'm a history major. I'm a poli-sci history major. I studied contemporary politics in the Middle East. I know nothing about Iran during World War II. And as I reflect on it, I don't remember anybody talking to me about Iran during World War II. And I regret now that I didn't ask my dad about it, because my dad would have been around at that time. Mom's a little young for it. But I wondered, is that a product of the Eurocentricity of the way history is written for those of us who are in the West? So if I learn history here, I'm learning it from a Western perspective, and that Western perspective talks about this is what Hitler did to Europe, this is the Japanese came and bombed US, but doesn't really give an F about Iran? Or is that also because even in Iran, this period has kind of been written out of history or not written into history? Tell us about that.
Well, I think there are two answers to that. One is the victors write the history. And so the Allies won. And because they won, history is written in that way, where Japan and Germany and Italy, to a lesser extent, were the really, really bad guys. But nobody wants to hear what the Allies did to Iran, where millions died because of their invasion.
By the way, the book is not a validation of Nazi Germany.
Not
just
at all. No,
in case anybody thinks you're...
No. Please, yes. No. Not at all. The character in the book, Sohrab Ahangar, is a kid that actually has a German friend and has a German sister-in-law. So he is very happy with these German people that are also helping build his country. They're building the telecommunications, they're building the roads, the railway. And so he doesn't see why Germany's the enemy. He sees the Russians and the British as the enemy because they've invaded his country and humiliated his country. And he wants the British and Russians to be humiliated too. By the end of the story, he thinks differently. That's one. And number two is, if you read ancient history, Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian. So the way he wrote about the Persians, he wrote a lot of great stuff about the Persians. But there's one thing that I read that he was talking about the lost army in Libya, the deserts in North Africa, where there was, I don't know how many thousand Iranian or Persian troops at that time just disappeared. It was a sandstorm or whatever it was. And as he's writing that he found a skull in one of these places, he says that I could tell that this was a Persian skull because it was smaller than the usual skull or something like that. So the victors write the history, and they write it whatever way they want.
The victors write the history, but they've really written Iran out of the history here, because it wasn't just that Iran was implicated in World War II by an invasion of the Allies that you talk about in the book, but also that millions died in Iran.
Exactly.
A lot of people, and I just don't remember. I mean, you're right. You don't. I also don't remember very much reading about the Japanese perspective of World War II either, and millions obviously died in that case as well. But it was interesting that, as someone who cares about Iran and Iranian history, and even talking to the equivalent of our village elders, in the Iranian community, I just haven't had, and when we do the Q&A with the audience, maybe it's a corrective. Maybe if you grew up in Iran, you know everything about this period, and it's just that those in the West didn't. But it's instructive that we didn't. Why did you want to focus on this area? Because clearly you can't write a book like this without some kind of due diligence. You don't want Abbas Milani coming after you going, this is ahistorical, what the fuck are you doing? Yeah. So why did you want to focus on this?
Because Iran was not a participant in the war. See, Japan, I can understand. Japan attacked a bunch of countries, occupied countries, the rape of Nanking and so forth. So you have an aggressor, and then if that aggressor gets defeated, and unfortunately many die, you go, okay, well, they started a war. But Iran had nothing to do with that. Iran was a neutral power, both in World War I and World War II. In World War I, Iran became the battleground for Turkish, Russian, and British forces, and about 1 million died. Of course, it also coincided with the flu, the pandemic, the Spanish flu at the time, at the end of the war. And then in World War II, some people are saying 4 million died. Iran at the time had 16 million people. You're talking a quarter of our population died because the Allies decided to attack us, occupy us, and take our food. And that was what just drove me nuts.
Let me get to that. But just to put it very succinctly, the idea was that Iran declares neutrality officially, but the Allies, i.e. the English, who are now teaming up with the Russians and then the US as well, are uncomfortable with the relationship that Iran and Iranians have with Germany, correct?
Correct. US wasn't that involved at that point, and the US involvement actually helped Iran. It's the British and the Russians who said that Reza Shah had leanings towards the Nazis, which of course he did because he was trying to counterbalance the British and Russian influence in Iran. In 1907, I have it in this book, the whole title of this book is based on that, The Harmless Necessary Cat.
Let me read that up. Okay. It was my next question, actually. Okay. The title.
I read your mind.
Thank you. You are a visionary. The Harmless Necessary Cat. The cat is Iran. And there's a scene where Sohrab, the young kid, Sohrab's dad has a British political cartoon on the wall that he likes that features the British and the Russians, and this cat in the middle, and they're lampooning Iran by calling it the harmless and necessary cat. How did the Russians and British see Iran as harmless in this period, and how did they see Iran as necessary?
Well, this Punch cartoon from 1907, actually, the person who drew it took it, the title, The Harmless Necessary Cat, from Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, where Shylock is defending himself. And he says, hey, you know, because Shylock was a moneylender, and so he creates this whole problem. He's saying, hey, why do you care? I'm almost like the harmless necessary cat that goes and gets the mice and everything. I'm like that. I help the economy, this kind of thing, defending himself. And so that's why the cartoonist used it. It's from Shakespeare 400 or 500 years ago. And harmless because Iran hadn't, the cat, I mean, had no claws even. You know, I mean, it was there ready for the taking. Necessary because in World War II, the Persian Corridor, from the Persian Gulf to Russia, all the U.S. land lease and also all the material that they needed to send to Russia went through Iran.
The harmless cat stands quite sharply in contradiction to the way Iranians would see themselves, the ferocious lion, right?
That's right. We have a lion on our flag, and if you see the cover of the book, instead of the lion, it's a cat. He still has a sword in his hand because Iranians fought valiantly for 4 days against two major world powers, but they just couldn't do it. And one of the things was that the generals had told Reza Shah, why don't we destroy our bridges, our roads, and all that? And Reza Shah was like, wait, painstakingly, I did all this stuff. I can't do it. And that allowed the Russians to go Jadeh Chalus, the Chalus road, come down and just take Tehran.
I want to get into what happens during World War II, but before we get there, you did this in your other book too. In your first book, where you there's a little bit of a Forrest Gump thing that happens in your writing, where we learn about significant moments in history because you weave them into the fiction of the book. And that's why, like I say, I really quite enjoy this, because I'm not just reading a fictionary tale, but I'm kind of reminded of things I've learned about Iranian history or moments that are significant. And so, to wit, in this book, there's a scene where, before World War II, 1936, Sohrab's mom, who's quite religious, and he doesn't feel connected to her, and their home servant Fatemeh, who's also quite religious, they are traumatized and terrorized because they can't go out in the street anymore wearing their hijab, because, spoiler alert, in direct contrast to the situation now in Iran, Reza Shah passes this edict that says no one's allowed to wear a hijab. And we see this from their perspective, although Sohrab doesn't necessarily agree with their religiosity. Why did you want to include that?
Well, first of all, even though it's historical fiction, most of this is true. So Fatima was a servant girl in my father's house. And this had happened to her. She had gone to the mosque one day, and the mullah had said, if one strand of your hair shows under your hijab, with that one strand of hair, you will be held over hellfire. And so Fatemeh was really superstitious and just took that to heart. And so she had gone to the bazaar in Qazvin one day, and they came and they said, take it off. And she said no, and she actually bites the chador like they used to do in Iran with their teeth when it was windy or whatever. So she's biting it, and they pull it off so violently from her that she falls on the ground, starts sobbing that everybody's seeing her hair. She had a mental breakdown. But the reason I put that in there was twofold. One was to show that 100 years ago, they were beating women to take it off. And 100 years later, they're beating women to put it on. And how terrible are the men who beat women whenever they think they want what they want the women should do. I mean, it's a terrible thing. I mean, as a man, I feel terrible that 100 years ago, we're beating women. 100 years now, later, we're beating, I mean.
About the same object of clothing.
About the same object of clothing. It's ridiculous. So that's why I put it in there. To say, hey, because
there's a few parallels. You mentioned it just a few moments ago. There's a few parallels that you also draw between Nazi Germany and the current government of Iran, subtly, but it's interesting to me, for example, that we mistakenly think of Germans as a monolith, like we think of everything, so we go, oh, Germans, 1940s, terrible people, and of course there were Germans who opposed the Nazi regime, and Krista, who is the wife of Arash Sohrab's brother, one of the reasons she leaves Germany is because she is traumatized by this Nazi regime, and she's part of a resistance. And the way you write about it, and you draw some links in there, feels very much like Iranians today, at odds with this another version of a Nazi regime, if you will. I mean, it's there's always troublesome using those terms, but the only major disconnect being that the Nazis were elected in a way that the current regime in Iran is not. But
well, I didn't really I didn't equate Nazism with the current regime. I just didn't, because I think that's not what I was trying to get at. What I was trying to get at is that the same way that the mullahs in the mosques with their sermons were able to ensnare and utilize people's suspicion, the Nazis were able to do the same thing through these radio broadcasts, where they would say, the great nation of Iran will soon be freed from the shackles of the Bolsheviks and the communists and all that. And so they were giving hope to the people through these still kind of fake hope, That's how I was comparing them.
The relationship of Iranians and Germans is fascinating. First of all, very affectionate. The Iranians in this story, at least, are very pro-German, pro-Germany. You mentioned Sohrab's best friend is Karl, who's this German kid. And there's a very positive feeling about Germany based on some of the industrial work that have been done in Iran. Can you explore that?
Well, as I said, Germany was involved in all aspects of Iran's development under Reza Shah. So railway, telecommunications, roads, bridges, just everything. Even helping in some small way in the military, training military and so forth. And so Iranians, when the Russians and the British, before they bomb, they throw leaflets down and say, leave the city, we're here to save you from the Germans. And Sohrab, I'm like, I see a flyer and I'm like, save us from who? From my sister-in-law that I love, from my friend that I love, from these guys that are helping build our country? Why are you dragging your war on our doorstep? So Iranians actually liked the Germans. Even and I write, there's one section in here where there's a manservant called Hadad who becomes like a brother to me. And he's telling me, he says, and this is true, this is also true. So I did a lot of research, and most of this is true. I can say most of it, except for some characters. But he says, and this is true, I read this, that in the kind of sort of poorer parts of Tehran, when they were showing, the British would show war movies, and they would always show the British winning and all that. But the people were cheering and jeering at the British and cheering when the Germans would beat the British. And the British didn't like it. The more that people would cheer for Germany, the British couldn't understand why Iranians are cheering for the Germans and then booing when the British would win something,
Well, and there's the scene in Meydan Sepehr, which is it's quite a remarkable scene. I mean, it's a pro-Germany rally, right? That was regularly held.
Right. Every week they had this. Actually, they had radios. People had shortwave radios, so you could tune in. And so at some point, the British realized these are getting too popular, so we're going to stop this public broadcasting. But it didn't work because people had radios in their homes, so they go listen to it. And then by chance, an irony, that the British asked the radios be put back because nobody would be listening to the British news broadcasts. So, you know.
I just got to note that you're popping your P's. So you just stay a little further away from the microphone.
Peter Piper Piffin.
You mentioned earlier, I mean, a major component of both what Reza Shah built and the impetus of the Russians and the British coming into into Iran in this period is the Trans-Iranian Railway. And you mentioned something called the Persian Corridor. What is that and why was it relevant?
Well, when Russia and Britain finally became allies, Russia was doing really badly during the war. I mean, they were afraid, the Allies were afraid that Germany is going to come through the Caucasus, take over Baku and the oil there, and then come on down and take Abadan. The refinery at Abadan produced, I forget how many, but like 8 million barrels a day at the time, or something like that. I don't know the exact number. But the British had just changed their military ships from coal to oil. And so they needed that. If the Germans came and took that, and they thought that the Germans are going to come both through North Africa with Rommel, the Africa Corps, and through the Caucasus. So they needed to stop that. One way they were doing it was by ships going to the ports in the north of Russia. But now it was getting icy wintertime, and also the U-boats. The Germans decided to use their U-boats. So they needed another route that was safer. So they had to come and basically take over Iran, to take over that railway that Reza Shah had built with such hardship. That's the Persian Corridor, where it was, you know, they give it names like that to make the Persians feel good, I guess. You know.
There's something you and I talked about a few days ago. We talked about it on the phone, and then it was in the book, where it's your contention that, you know, Iranians in the 20th century develop a notable anti-Western attitude. And before everybody says, no, we love American genes and all of that, it does culminate in the 1979 revolution, for better or for worse, and for some, obviously for much worse. But some see that anti-Western, whether it's anti-colonial, whether it's anti-British, whether it's anti-American sentiment, that the inflection point is Mossadegh in 1953. Some may argue it was always there, but you think it's this period. You think it's the Allied invasion that before that, Iranians are, as a people, relatively West positive. But when you start getting bombed by the British and the Russians, it's like we're not so pro-West anymore.
Well, not only bombed, as I said, the food. So the Russians needed food to support their troops. So they took all the harvest from the Caspian area, the north of Iran, and shipped it for their soldiers fighting the German war machine. And the British mismanaged the harvest in the south of Iran, mismanaged the water and all that kind of stuff. And so my belief is that, you know, everybody talks about Mossadegh was the time when the Iranians started hating the US and the British for overthrowing, you know, Mossadegh. But Mossadegh was in 1953. This invasion was in 1941. So 12 years earlier, I think that that's a much stronger reason to hate the West if you're an Iranian at that time, is that they've invaded you. They've humiliated you. They've taken your food. 3 to 4 million of your people, if you believe some of the researchers, but I think it might have been closer to 2 million, but still, died. You know, so Mossadegh is just a symptom. The root cause was 1940.
I'm pretty sure that's a contentious point. And maybe
Right.
some people will be able to talk about that, but it's an interesting one for sure. You mentioned earlier Sohrab's sympathies with the Nazis. He's like, these are not the people who have dropped bombs on us or leaflets and I have a good, and he has a good feeling about Germans, and he has German friends, and he doesn't. He goes to those. He hears about Hitler, and he doesn't necessarily have a bad impression. And there's this interesting juxtaposition, the moment in the book where Karl, his close friend who's German, is trying to explain to Sohrab, no, the Nazis are bad, German, and he's like, but I like Germans. What? Explore that a little bit, because assuming that you have some relationship to Sohrab, that's an interesting thing that you went through.
Well, Sohrab is a teenager at this point. So first of all, he doesn't know much. It's all what he's seeing. And he is seeing, as I said, the British and the Russians coming in, troops, you know, everywhere they're going, it's hard to go, tanks and troops and all that. And in Ghazvin, Sohrab's cousin's house gets bombed. And so they go to see it firsthand. And everybody's just shocked. They're shocked at why. I mean, Iran's not involved in this war. So Sohrab is not pro-Nazi. He's pro-German. That's the difference. He doesn't even know about Nazis. And that's the whole thing. Karl keeps trying to tell him, no, I was there. He remembers Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. And he keeps telling him, and still he doesn't get it. And he says, you know, Kristallnacht happened because they say a Jewish man, assassin, killed the German ambassador to Paris, or consul general in Paris. And Sohrab saying, but there's this nice Jewish man who's my father's friend, sells carpets in the bazaar. Why? Why would they hate the Jewish people? You know, he doesn't get it. So he doesn't know about not that. He likes Germans. He likes their war efficiency. He doesn't know, and even Karl's uncle in this, he's a Luftwaffe pilot. So it's a pro-German, not a pro-Nazi feel that he has. That's
the famine, the starvation, and the devastation. It seems like a dumb thing, even by the standards of the people bombing Iranians into wanting to love them. It seems like a dumb thing to do to the Iranian people. What were the Russians thinking?
The Russians didn't care. The Russians were thinking, our soldiers are fighting the Germans. These Germans have come, they've raped our women, they've destroyed our country, and I'm going to do anything I can to protect my country, even if it means I have to go into Iran and take their food. That's what they thought. It's like almost any country might do that if you feel you're at the point of defeat by an outside force. You know, that's what I think.
By 1943, you talk about how Tehran is transformed. It's overrun with British soldiers, American soldiers at that point as well, who are kind of becoming the hustle and bustle of the city. It's a pivotal year because it's when the Tehran Conference happens. Talk about how important that year is, not just for World War II, but in Iranian history.
Well, 1943 is very important because so Stalin was afraid to fly. So he decides to take a train from Baku to come to Tehran. That's why Tehran was chosen, because Stalin didn't want to go anywhere else. And so Roosevelt and Churchill agree. And this was their first meeting where they were going to decide the D-Day invasion. And there's a lot of historical background about how actually Stalin and Roosevelt were more on the same page than Churchill was. And there is a funny story. I didn't write it in the book. I'd like to say it. It's a little risque. But so Stalin was very suspicious of the friendship of Roosevelt and Churchill. He knew that they had met in different places and they were very close. And so they decided to have the meeting in the Soviet embassy on Khiyabun Churchill, whoever remembers it in Iran. And actually, our mutual friend Fred Parvane, his family had a house right across the Russian embassy on Churchill Street. So whenever I'd go to visit him as a kid, we'd always look in there. We could see and there was always a secret savak outside in a Paycon. We always used to see these two. The two guys were out there. Everybody knew that these guys are like looking at the embassy. But anyway, so supposedly there was even a tunnel built between the Russian embassy and the British embassy because they were very close to each other in downtown Tehran. So that the meetings were held in the Russian embassy because there was a fear, or at least Stalin's people had said, that they're going to try to do some sort of an attack, the Germans. And so the Russian embassy is the most safe and secure. So they were having the meetings there. During one of these meetings, Stalin notices that Churchill and Roosevelt are passing a note between each other. And he gets very kind of curious, and he's kind of a little jealous, envious. And so he tells, when the meeting's over, he tells his chief of security at the time, was a man named Ivanovich Against. And he says, find out what they were talking about. But I don't want you to tell me what they were talking about. I read this in a Russian book.
I was going to say, where did you know?
No, in a Russian book. It's called Tehran 1943 or something. Operation
Oh, you were like in a barber shop and somebody said,
yeah. And he said, Stalin told me. And so Alliance goes and finds the actual note. And the note was a note from Roosevelt to Churchill saying, "Sir, your fly is open." And Churchill writes back on that same note, he says, "No worries, the old eagle will not fall out of its nest." So it was that level of, intrigue between the three of them, even though they were about to basically take over the world.
And it didn't make the book. Story of Iran.
I didn't put it in on purpose because I wanted to use it today.
Before we open it up for any questions or comments from the crowd here, there's a very moving Sepehr. You do an author's note at the beginning of the book, and there's it ends in a very moving way. And you say, you've clearly done a lot of research to do this book. It's one thing to write a book of creative fiction or creative nonfiction. It's another to place it somewhere where you have to do the historical work. And you say, if I'm paraphrasing you, if I can quote you, you say, what you learned in this process, writing this book, was that you are in awe of the resilience of the Iranian people.
Their spirit.
Yeah, talk about that.
Well, really, as I was doing this research, and and also what's not in the book is, of course, the years that I lived in Iran and how Iran was moving forward, and then all of a sudden the revolution happened, and then how it's now being bad-mouthed all around the world, even though the people are the people. And so my whole point was that the ethos of Iran is not found in just that land. It's found in every fabric of what Iranian culture is. And I say in there, in every note of a sitar, every thread of a Persian carpet, every motif of Persian art, and that it's in the collective memory of the culture, no matter where they are. Like us right now, we're mostly Persian here, Iranian, and value Iranian culture, value Iranian art. You don't have to be sitting in Tehran to do that. And we're sitting here in Toronto, Canada, speaking about it and being proud of what this country is all about. That's why I wrote it.
But the resilience part.
Yes, resilience. And, you think about it, 700 years of Arab conquest, something like that, I think, that many years, still couldn't crush the Iranian spirit. Even what's happening now in Iran, still the Iranian spirit lives, and it will live. It will continue. I can guarantee that. I'll say it.
And thank you so much for being here. Have some wine. Sepehr Haddad.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Big thanks to Sepehr Haddad and his wife for coming up here from Washington, D.C. to be part of our event last week. His new book really is worth reading. If you have a chance to pick it up, go to Amazon or wherever you get your books in and order it. Not only is it instructional about Iran's history, but it's a compelling read. Thanks to him. Thanks to everybody who came out last week to our Roqe Hub. We're going to be doing more of those things, so stay tuned, especially if you're in the greater Toronto area. Thanks to the amazing team who put this show together each week. Super Parisa, Smart Pega, Seppi Wonder, Savvy Roham, and Tina, the photo and video queen. And special thanks to Bearded Omid, Talented Anahita, Methodical Kaveh, and Solid Samin. Thank you to all of you out there for supporting us and sharing our content. Do subscribe if you haven't done so already. You can find Roqe across our platforms at Roqe Media. Find me on Instagram at Jian Ghomeshi. And as ever, Mizun Bashin.